Chapter 2. Barton. It was now September, and the weather was fine. The journey from Sussex to Devon was a very long one. The Dashwoods had to travel for many years, for many hours, in a carriage before they reached their new home. At first, the family felt miserable, but as they got nearer to Barton, they became happier. Devon was beautiful county, and the Dashwoods saw interesting views as they looked out of the carriage windows. There were narrow roads and steep hill covered with trees. The land in this county was completely different from Sussex. Button Cottage was a small, well-built and comfortable little house. It stood beside a road in a valley. The village of Button was on one of the hills behind the cottage. In front of the cottage there was a lawn of green grass. A fence with a small wooden gate separated the lawn from the road. At the back of the cottage there was a pretty garden surrounded by a wall. Mrs. Dashwood opened the small wooden gate and walked up to the front door of the cottage. Soon the family was standing in the sitting room and looking around happily. "Well, here we are, my dears," Mrs. Dashwood said to her three daughters. "Our new home is not large, but we can have extra rooms built very easily. Marian's piano looks very fine by the window. Now we must unpack our books and your paintings, Eleanor. Then Butter Cottage will start to look like our own home." The three girls and their mother began to unpack their things at once. And the next day, just after breakfast, they had their first visitor, Sir John Middleton of Barton Park. Sir John was a 40-year-old, good-looking, very friendly gentleman. Two servants came in his carriage with him. They brought fruit, vegetables, and other food for Sir John's cousins. Sir John also brought a polite message from his wife, Lady Middleton. Mrs. Dashwood was delighted. She invited the Middletons to visit Barton Cottage, and they both called the next day. Lady Middleton was tall, well-dressed, and good-looking. She was about 13 years younger than her husband. She was not very clever or well-educated, and she did not have much to say. But as she had brought one of her young sons with her, all the ladies talked about him. Before the Middletons left the cottage, Sir John invited the Dashwoods to dinner at Barton Park. "We both love having visitors," he said. "Our home is not far, just half a mile through the park. It is a very pleasant walk." Barton Park was a large, well-furnished house, and the Middletons both enjoyed inviting young people to stay there. Sir John was a sportsman, and he often went hunting and shooting with his friends. Lady Middleton spent most of her time with her children, and she enjoyed entertaining her neighbors too. The Middletons were delighted with the Dashwoods. The three girls were charming and pretty, and their mother was a very pleasant friend. Sir John was waiting to greet them when they arrived. "Welcome, welcome to Barton Park," he said, laughing happily. "I am afraid that we do not have many other guests here to meet you today, But my wise mother, Mrs. Jennings, has just arrived, and my good friend, Colonel Brandon, is staying with us. He lives at Delaford, which is not far away, so he is your neighbor as well as mine. Mrs. Daniels, Lady Middleton's mother, was a cheerful, fat old lady. Her two daughters had both married rich men. Her elder daughter was married to Sir John. Her younger daughter, Charlotte, had married a member of Parliament named Thomas Palmer. Now, Mrs. Jennings' main interest was to find good husbands for all the unmarried ladies in the neighborhood. Mrs. Jennings was a kind woman, but her manners were not always good. She loved to gossip. She found out other people's secret and private business, and she talked about them. At dinner, she sat between Eleanor and Marian. Well, my dears, you must tell me all about yourselves, she said. I'm sure, I'm sure, I'm sure, British English, I'm sure, American English, that you both left young men in Sussex who were fond of you. They must have been sorry when you went away, but they will be coming to Barton soon, I'm sure. I'm sure. Eleanor smiled politely, and Marian shook her head. Neither sister answered the old lady, so she laughed and teased them. I shall find out your secret very soon, Miss Dashwood and Miss Marian, she said. Colonel Brandon was a quiet, sensible man, and she said very little. He was tall, with a serious face and good manners. The colonel was about 35 years old, and Mrs. Jennings soon told the Dashwood's girls he was not married. Marian and Margaret thought that he was too old to be interesting. After dinner, Mrs. Jennings continued to tease the Dashwood sisters. She made jokes about love and lovers. Lady Middleton looked bored with the conversation and said nothing. She only smiled when her four noisy children ran into the room and began to shout loudly. Late in the evening, Sir John asked Marian to play the piano and sing. Everyone praised the young woman's singing, but only Colonel Brandon listened carefully and with real pleasure. Mrs. Jennings noticed this, and she was soon teasing the Colonel and Marian too. Miss Marian, she said, Colonel Brandon has fallen in love with you. You sing and play delightfully. The Colonel is rich and you're beautiful. It will be an excellent marriage. Colonel Brandon did not care what Mrs. Jennings teased him, but Marian did not know if she should laugh or cry. She thought that the old lady was being very foolish. Colonel Brandon is far too old to fall in love, Marian told her family when they were home again. He said that he had a pain in his shoulder, so he was going to wear a thick, warm coat. Did you hear him say that? Men of his age should not marry unless they need a nurse. The colonel is not old, and he looks very healthy, Eleanor said with a smile. He does not need a nurse. Marian did not reply. She was not interested in Colonel Brandon. Later, she spoke to her mother alone. Mama, I'm worried about Edward Ferrars, she said. Do you think that he is ill? We have been at Barton for nearly 2 weeks now. Edward knows that we are here. Why has he not come to see Eleanor? And why will Eleanor not talk about him? Eleanor and Edward are so cold-hearted. I could not hide my feelings as Eleanor does. The Dashwoods were very happy in their new home. They often visited the Middletons and received calls from them. But because the Dashwoods had no carriage of their own, they did not travel far in the county. They met very few other people. While the weather was fine, the girls went on long walks. Then there were several days of heavy rain. All the paths became wet and muddy, and the girls had to stay at home. Then, one morning, Marian looked out of the sitting room window and saw that the rain clouds had disappeared. The sky was now blue and the sun was shining. Look, the sun is shining at last, she said. Let us all go out for a walk. Eleanor was drawing and Mrs. Dashwood was reading, and they did not want to go out. Only Margaret wanted to go out walking with her sisters. She wanted to go walking with her sister. Soon the two girls were walking up the nearest hill. In the next valley, there was a fine old house called Allenham Court. Marian and Margaret stood on the top of the hill and admired the property. Sir John had told them that the house belonged to an old lady whose name was Mrs. Smith. She was too ill to call on people, and she did not have many visitors. What exciting weather! Marian cried as the wind blew in their faces. I could walk here for a long time without getting tired. The girls walked on, laughing and talking. Suddenly, the rain clouds returned and the sky became dark. Soon rain began to fall heavily. There were no trees or buildings nearby. There was nowhere for the sisters to shelter from rain. They turned back at once to go home. They ran as fast as they could down the hill and back towards the cottage. Soon they were both very wet. At first, Marian was in front, but then she slipped on. She wet grass and fell to the ground. She cried out in pain. Margaret was running too fast and she could not stop. The young girl ran down to the cottage and reached the garden safely. But poor Marian had hurt her ankle and she could not move. She lay on the grass, getting wetter and wetter in the cold rain. Margaret, I cannot stand, Marian shouted. Bring someone to help me. At that moment, a young man came over the hill. He was carrying a gun and had his two hunting dogs with him. When he saw Marian, he put down his gun and ran to help her. Marian tried to get up, but her ankle hurt her too much. Without speaking, the gentleman lifted Marian in his arms and carried her down the hill. He quickly reached the house and took her inside. The Dashwoods were very surprised to see Marian in the arms of a strange young man. They watched in silence as he carried Marian into the sitting room and placed her carefully on a chair. I surprise you, and I apologize, the young gentleman said politely, but this lady needed my help. She has hurt her ankle, and she cannot walk alone. And as you see, she is very wet and cold. Please do not apologize, Mrs. Dashwood replied. It is lucky that you were nearby. Please sit down. May I ask your name, sir? The young man was extremely handsome, and his voice and manners were very pleasing. My name is Willoughby, he said, and he bowed politely towards Mrs. Dashwood. I am at present living at Allenham, and I must not sit down because my clothes are wet. Perhaps I may call tomorrow. I would like to ask about the young lady's health. You will be very welcome, Mrs. Dashwood replied. The lady whom you rescued is my daughter, Miss Marian Dashwood. There are her sisters, Anna and Margaret. We are all very grateful to you. The young man bowed again and left the room without saying another word. The Dashwoods all looked at each other. What a handsome young man! Margaret cried. I look forward to seeing him again. What do you think of him, Marian? Marian smiled, but she could not speak. Willoughby. His name was Willoughby. Here at last was the perfect young man of her dreams. When Sir John Middleton called at Barton Cottage, Mrs. Dashwood told him about Marian's fall and her handsome rescuer, Willoughby. John Willoughby? Sir John cried, laughing happily. Is in the neighborhood? What good news! I shall invite him to dinner Thursday. Do you know him? Mrs. Dashwood asked. What kind of young man is he? Willoughby is a fine young man, Sir John replied. He stays in Devon every year. He has many fine horses, and he rides very well. He shoots well, too. Does he have property near here? Eleanor asked. He said that he was staying in Allenham. Mrs. Smith, the old lady at Allenham Court, is his aunt, said John explained to Eleanor. Willoughby is Mrs. Smith's heir. He has a whole house in the county of Somerset, too. He would make a fine husband for any girl. Mr. Willoughby is certainly worth sketching, Miss Dashwood. Then he added with a laugh, Miss Marian has already caught Colonel Brandon, remember? Said John, my daughter, do not catch young men, Mr. Dashwood said. But if Willoughby is a suitable neighbor, we shall all be glad to meet him at Barton Park. He's a very lovely young man, Sir John answered. On Christmas Day last year, he came to our party. He danced all the evening, and then he got up early the next morning to go hunting. Oh, he's just the kind of man like I like, Marian cried, her eyes shining with happiness. I very much want to see Mr. Willoughby again.